We've already seen the things that make a hormone work better in the body, and that would be the amount of the hormone produced and increasing the number of receptors. Also, a hormone is more likely to bind to a high affinity receptor and activate it for a little bit longer than it would a low affinity receptor. So now we're going to look at how we adjust those receptors. And that's up regulation or down regulation. This is the way that the body or the cells can sensitize themselves more to a hormone or less to a hormone. The cell can metabolize the receptor and decrease the number of available receptors for a hormone to bind to. Now, it will typically do that when it's exposed to chronically high levels of a hormone. You'll basically become a little bit resistant to that hormone, so that that hormone doesn't have as strong of an action just because it's elevated all the time. A really good example of this is with the insulin receptor. Now, when the body is exposed to persistently high levels of insulin, this cell is actually going to degrade the insulin receptors on its surface. So here's a bunch of receptors for insulin. And when insulin comes along, in response to very high levels of blood glucose, it's going to signal this cell to take glucose up out of the blood. So this cell is going to take these glucose molecules out of the blood and into the cell. But when this cell starts to take on too much glucose, or when it's exposed to too much insulin, it's going to pop. It doesn't want that much excess glucose because glucose can actually be toxic to a cell. So what it will do is it will actually metabolize the receptor and degrade it. It will metabolize the receptor and degrade it. Now, when insulin comes along, it's much less likely to affect the cell and cause the cell to take up glucose. So this was the cell's way of decreasing the amount of glucose that it takes up. This is actually what happens when we develop type 2 diabetes or adult onset diabetes or insulin resistance. Basically, the cells have metabolized their receptors because of exposure to very high insulin levels for prolonged periods of time and exposure to too high of glucose levels. And now, this cell isn't taking up any glucose. And blood glucose levels in return remain high around this cell. And that's diabetes. Very high blood glucose levels, which only exacerbates the problem, because if this cell decides to upregulate the number of receptors or increase the number of receptors, well, that could prove problematic for the cell. So glucose metabolism and the insulin receptor is a classic example of downregulation, or in the opposite case, if somebody rarely eats blood glucose and rarely gets their blood values up to elevated amounts, if they don't like candy and soda, well, when they do eat a little bit of glucose, they quickly release insulin. And this cell hasn't metabolized any of its receptors. Rather, it's upregulated the number of receptors. So it's very responsive to this insulin. And when insulin binds to that receptor, it quickly takes the blood glucose out of the blood and into the cell. And now blood glucose levels are low. So we don't have a lot of insulin. So the cell maintains its sensitivity. It keeps those receptors around. Or it even upregulates them, installs more. This is great insulin sensitivity. Insulin sensitivity. All as a result of upregulation. This is actually how a lot of diabetic drugs like metformin work. They improve insulin sensitivity, not only from the cascade inside the cell that occurs through, your book says it doesn't have a second messenger system, I disagree, but also by maintaining these receptors on the outside of the cell. Now, one of the examples that texts give is the effect of progesterone and estrogen on the cells of the uterus. Now remember, estrogen and progesterone are largely responsible for developing this tunica, this endometrial lining, especially the functional layer. Now, when estrogen levels are elevated, when we have high estrogen, this will actually upregulate progesterone. So these cells sprout more progesterone receptors. Now, high progesterone has the opposite effect on estrogen. It actually decreases the number of estrogen receptors in the uterine lining. So where estrogen will upregulate progesterone receptors, progesterone can downregulate estrogen receptors. This increases or decreases the effectiveness of the respective hormones.